Welcome to a deep dive into some seriously challenging ideas today. We're cracking open a text that really questioned, well, pretty much everything we thought we knew about truth, morality, and, what it means to be human.
We are. We're looking at excerpts from Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. And our source stack, it pulls from his Prejudices of Philosophers, sections on the natural history of morals, and other parts of this really dense, provocative book.
And our mission today is basically to guide you through it. We want to unpack Nietzsche's often radical critique of, traditional philosophical and moral thinking. We'll pull out the most compelling, maybe even surprising insights and try to get a handle on what he was really getting at.
Yeah, get ready for some perspectives that might just flip your assumptions upside down.
So let's dive right in with a concept Nietzsche hits on pretty much immediately in Beyond Good and Evil. This is the thing he calls the will to truth. Now, normally we think wanting truth is just. Right. Seems pure, noble even.
Exactly. That's the default assumption. But Nietzsche asks us to, pause and really examine that impulse. He asks, and this is a direct quote, "What questions has this will to truth not laid before us? What strange, perplexing, questionable questions?" He wants us to turn the lens on the seeker of truth itself. He suggests we need to ask ourselves, who is it really that puts questions to us here? What really is this will to truth in us?
Wow. Okay, so he's not just questioning the results of seeking truth, but the actual motive behind it. Why do we even want truth in the first place?
Precisely. He posits that this drive, it might not come from a pure, disinterested desire for knowledge at all. It could perhaps surprisingly originate in something far less exalted, maybe even a popular superstition of immemorial time.
Like what kind of superstition?
Well, he gives the example of the soul superstition, which, he argues, still causes mischief today in how we think about ourselves as a distinct subject or ego. The idea of a unified I doing the thinking.
Okay, right. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. He suggests that the bedrock belief for a lot of traditional philosophers, the metaphysicians, is what he calls the belief in antitheses of values.
Yeah, things like true versus false, good versus evil. They just assume these are fundamental opposite realities.
But Nietzsche questions that.
He immediately throws shade on that assumption. He doubts if these clear-cut antitheses even exist in the way we think they do. Maybe, he suggests, they are just superficial estimates, merely provisional perspectives. Useful, perhaps, but not, fundamental truths about reality.
But here's the kicker, isn't it? The truly counterintuitive idea that challenges everything we're taught. He argues that, and I quote, "the falseness of an opinion is not for us any objection to it."
Think about that.
We're usually taught that false is bad, end of story. But Nietzsche says the real question isn't true or false, but how far an opinion is life-furthering, life-preserving, species-preserving.
He goes even further. He claims that the falsest opinions are the most indispensable to us. He means that certain fictions, certain ways of simplifying or maybe even distorting reality might be absolutely necessary for human life to flourish, or maybe even just to continue.
So he's saying that maybe, just maybe, we need to recognize untruth as a condition of life. That's a direct challenge to our core values.
It absolutely is.
He suggests things like logical fictions, comparing reality to purely imagined worlds, or even using abstract numbers to sort of counterfeit reality might be necessary for us. And renouncing these false but useful opinions might actually be a renunciation of life itself. That's a heavy thought right out of the gate.
It certainly is. And this whole line of questioning about motives and the nature of truth, it leads Nietzsche to look at philosophers themselves through a different lens. He sees them not as purely objective seekers of truth,
No.
but rather as advocates defending their deepest convictions and, yes, their prejudices.
He puts it pretty bluntly, too, doesn't he? Saying, what every great philosophy up till now has consisted of, namely, the confession of its originator.
Exactly. Their grand systems of thought are, in a way, deeply personal, almost autobiographical. They're shaped by their fundamental impulses.
And he connects this back to those physiological demands you mentioned earlier.
Right. He argues that behind all logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement, there are valuations, or to speak more plainly, physiological demands for the maintenance of a definite mode of life.
For instance?
Well, for instance, valuing certainty over uncertainty. That might not be a purely rational choice, but a deep-seated need, perhaps even a necessary niaiserie, a kind of fundamental folly or simplicity that's just required for us to function as the kind of beings we are.
This feels like it's leading us towards a really core concept in Nietzsche's work, The will to power.
Yes, absolutely. He sees this not just as, like, a simple desire for dominance over others, but as a fundamental drive that underlies pretty much everything, our actions, thoughts, even our search for truth. It's the drive to grow, overcome, expand, create.
And he uses this idea to critique other philosophical
He
staples.
does. He points out the logical contradiction in the old idea of causasu,
Yeah.
the notion of something being its own cause, like a self-generated being. Totally impossible, logically.
But we like the idea.
Well, he knows how human pride often gets tangled up in this folly, especially through the desire for freedom of will. We want to believe we are entirely self-caused masters of our own destiny, but Nietzsche finds this philosophically pretty shaky.
He even takes on something as seemingly simple as Descartes, I think, that famous starting point.
Oh, yeah. Nietzsche says this statement assumes a whole lot we can't easily prove. Like, that it's specifically I who is thinking, that thinking requires an agent or cause at all, that there's a distinct ego separate from the thought itself.
Or even that we know what thinking is.
Exactly. Or that we truly understand what thinking is compared to other mental states like willing or feeling. He's basically deconstructing the very foundation of a lot of modern philosophy right there.
Okay. And the will itself. Not simple either, I gather.
Not at all. He says it's something complicated. He breaks it down into several ingredients: sensations, thinking, and crucially, emotion. And in fact, the emotion of the command, that feeling of directing something or someone, even ourselves.
That's fascinating. So the feeling we have of freedom of the will, it isn't some abstract philosophical truth, but it's essentially the emotion of supremacy in respect to him who must obey.
Pretty much, whether that's your own body, your own impulses, or another person. It's primarily a feeling of command, of overcoming resistance.
Right.
And he connects this back, naturally, to the philosopher. If the will to power is fundamental, then for the philosopher, Nietzsche suggests that knowing isn't just passively observing reality. It's creating. And that creating isn't just making stuff up randomly, it's law-giving. It's imposing form and meaning. This leads to his really provocative conclusion later in the book. The will to truth is will to power.
So the drive for truth is just another form of this power drive.
In his view, yes. The philosopher's drive for truth is ultimately a manifestation of this fundamental will to create, to impose their perspective, to give laws to reality as they see it.
Okay, so if our drive for truth is really will to power in disguise, and philosophers are driven by their fundamental impulses, how does that apply to something as foundational as, say, morality?
Well, that's the next logical step in his critique, isn't it? He turns his attention squarely to morality itself.
Yeah.
And he views every system of morals as, and this is his phrase, a sort of tyranny against nature and also against reason.
Tyranny, that sounds pretty negative, right? Morality as tyranny.
It does, initially. But here's the surprising twist, and it's a key paradox in Nietzsche. He also says this constraint is essential and invaluable in every system of morals. He calls it a long constraint.
How can it be both?
He uses analogies like training a dancer or a musician. He suggests that traits we value, things like freedom, elegance, boldness, dance, and masterly certainty, well, they've only developed by means of the tyranny of such arbitrary law.
Ah, I see. Okay. So even though it's a kind of tyranny, it's a necessary one for development, for shaping something raw into something refined and, well, powerful.
Precisely. It's almost like nature's imperative, as he puts it. Thou must obey someone, and for a long time. Otherwise thou wilt come to grief and lose all respect for thyself. You need that discipline, that structure, even if it feels imposed, externally or internally.
Right. Makes sense in that context.
And he also challenges where we typically locate the moral worth of an action. Today, we usually focus on the intention behind it. You know, if you meant well, the action is basically good.
Yeah, that seems standard.
But Nietzsche notes that historically that wasn't always the case. Often, the value of an action was inferred from its consequences, its actual impact on the world.
And shifting the focus to intention, that seems like a refinement, maybe. A great achievement, as he calls it.
He acknowledges it was, yes. But he believes morality, as intention morality, has now become a prejudice, something which must be surmounted.
Why surmount?
He suggests that focusing solely on conscious intention misses the deeper forces, the instincts, the drives, the will to power, that truly shape why we act the way we do. It's too superficial for him.
Okay, so we've questioned the will to truth, seen how philosophers' instincts shape their ideas, and looked at morality as this necessary tyranny that maybe focuses too much on intention. How does he then explain the different moral systems we actually see in the world?
This brings us to one of his most famous concepts, the distinction between master morality and slave morality. He presents this as a kind of historical dynamic.
And he traces the origin of slave morality controversially.
Very controversially, yes. He specifically traces what he calls the slave insurrection and morals back to the Jews. It's important to state we're reporting his historical claim here, which is obviously highly charged.
And he says they achieved this by inverting values. How does that work?
Well, he argues they took the values associated with the ruling classes, things like strength, wealth, power, health, things the masters called good, and out of resentment, fused them with concepts like godless or wicked, effectively branding them as evil.
And at the same time,
Simultaneously, they elevated their own condition being poor, suffering, humble, meek, making these characteristics synonymous with saint or good. It was, in his view, a fundamental revaluation born out of the powerlessness and suffering of the oppressed.
okay, let's break these two down a bit. What does noble morality or master morality actually look like, according to him?
So according to Nietzsche, this arises organically from a ruling class, from people who are strong, powerful, and see themselves as the creators of value. Their values are self-affirmative. They define good as what they are and what is like them.
So traits like pride.
Yes. Pride, a certain severity towards oneself, needing enemies to define themselves against, a capacity for strong gratitude, and also strong revenge, but mainly within their circle of equals, that sort of thing.
And they have contempt for others.
A profound disdain for lying, actually. He notes they call themselves we truthful ones, referencing the nobility in ancient Greece. And crucially, they feel they have duties only to their equals. Towards those of lower rank or outside their group, they act more spontaneously, perhaps even harshly, essentially beyond good and evil. Their actions aren't judged by the same moral code that might apply within the group or the code of the subdued.
Okay. And slave morality, then, the opposite.
It arises from the other side, from the oppressed, the suffering, the powerless. Their values aren't self-affirmative in the same way. They're reactive. They're born from what he calls a pessimistic suspicion towards the powerful and their values.
So they label the master's traits as evil.
Exactly. Strength, pride, freedom, health, these get branded as evil. Consequently, they value the opposite qualities, the ones that help the weak survive. Safety, patience, kindness, tolerance, humility, pity, equality.
It sounds like a morality of utility for the collective, for the herd.
You could say that. Anything that elevates an individual above the general level, above the herd, is seen as dangerous and therefore evil from this perspective. It desires freedom, yes, but often freedom from suffering or oppression. It seeks happiness, often understood as the alleviation of pain.
And master morality values something else.
He contrasts it with master morality valuing things like artifice and enthusiasm and reverence and devotion. And he even makes the provocative claim that love as a passion, is our European specialty, must absolutely be of noble origin. He suggests this intense, individualistic, passionate love is a sort of refinement or derivative of the noble drive, not something born from utility.
And he connects the historical rise of slave morality to what he sees as the degeneracy of humanity, making us into a gregarious animal, a herd.
Yes, that's his rather bleak assessment. He argues that in a society where slave morality becomes dominant, the conditions favor the survival and continuation of the incurably mediocre. This morality of mediocrity, focused on safety, comfort, and equality, has to talk a lot about things like moderation and dignity and duty and brotherly love to essentially mask, or perhaps forget, its origins in weakness and resentment.
So if he sees slave morality as being in ascendancy in his time, it makes sense that he'd be pretty critical of modern values that seem to stem from it.
Absolutely. That's a key part of his critique in Beyond Good and Evil. He sees modern democratic ideas, with their strong emphasis on equality of rights and sympathy with all sufferers, as direct outgrowths of this slave morality winning out historically. These values, he argues, reinforce the herd mentality.
And he's particularly harsh on pity and sympathy, isn't he?
Very much so. He views widespread pity and sympathy as problematic, even a form of unmanliness, as he puts it quite starkly. He challenges the modern constant preaching of sympathy, suggesting it often comes laced with a hoarse, groaning, genuine note of self-contempt from the person expressing it.
Self-contempt. Wow.
He even calls, paradoxically, for sympathy against sympathy. His reasoning is that he believes certain kinds of suffering, struggle, and hardship are actually necessary for the development of higher types of individuals, for growth and overcoming. So universal sympathy that tries to eliminate all suffering is actually detrimental to human potential, in his view. It's a very brutal, anti-egalitarian perspective.
And he connects the whole democratic movement in Europe to this larger trend.
Yes, he sees it as part of an immense physiological process, no less, resulting in the leveling and mediocrising of man. It makes everyone more similar, more manageable, useful, industrious, creating a clever, gregarious man who ultimately, he thinks, require a master, even if they don't realize it.
He applies this critique even to nations, doesn't he? Quite controversially.
Extremely controversially. He makes sweeping statements, for instance, claiming that the European noblesse is the work and invention of France, associating France with aristocratic values, while the European ignobleness, the plebeianism of modern ideas, is England's work and invention.
Ouch! And the English utilitarians.
He dismisses them quite scathingly as an unassuming and fundamentally mediocre species of man, because their philosophy focuses on maximizing happiness for the greatest number, a goal he sees as fundamentally herd-like, aiming for comfort and utility rather than greatness or overcoming.
And then there are his views on women as presented in this text. These are also quite challenging to read today.
They are indeed very harsh and undeniably reflect the deep-seated prejudices of his time and place. He states quite plainly that woman retrogrades as she strives for things like economic and legal independence. He interprets this movement towards equality as a disintegration of womanly instincts, a defeminizing.
He even quotes others saying women should be silent.
Yes. He cites examples of men saying women should essentially be silent in certain spheres, like politics. It's crucial, again, for us and for you listening to remember that these are Nietzsche's views, as presented in this specific text. They reflect a particular historical and cultural context, and they are certainly jarring and offensive from a modern perspective.
Yeah.
We're reporting on the content of the source here neutrally, not endorsing these views in any way.
Right. Absolutely. Just unpacking what's in the book itself, it's a difficult section. But despite all this critique of leveling and mediocrity, he doesn't think this universal degeneracy is the only possible outcome. He sees another possibility.
That's right. He implies, somewhat paradoxically, that these very same conditions, the leveling, the tension, the herd morality, might also create the necessary pressure or environment for the opposite to emerge, exceptional men of the most dangerous and attractive qualities. The pressure cooker might forge something extraordinary.
Which leads us to consider what kind of individual Nietzsche does actually value, his ideal, perhaps.
Exactly. So against this backdrop of what he critiques, the herd, the mediocrity, the slave morality, what is Nietzsche's ideal? He speaks often of the noble soul.
And what defines that?
Fundamentally, he says it has reverence for itself. It's about a deep self-respect, valuing one's own being, one's own path, creating one's own values.
And this select man, this noble soul, sounds pretty solitary.
Inherently so, it seems. He says the select man strives instinctively for a citadel and a privacy, where he is free from the crowd. They need distance, detachment from the herd and its values.
But they can't ignore the crowd entirely.
Interestingly, no. He notes they sometimes need to go down and inside to study the average man, even though they might find it disagreeable. It's like they need to understand the world they live in, including the dynamics of the herd, but they don't fundamentally belong to it.
And the philosopher, then, the higher type of philosopher he envisions, how do they fit in?
This figure, as he and the free spirits he describes understand them, is the man of the greatest responsibility. Someone who has the conscience for the general development of mankind.
So not just an abstract thinker.
No, they are thinkers, yes, but with a broad historical perspective and a sense of purpose regarding humanity's future. He even suggests they might use things like religion or political structures not as absolute truths for themselves, but as tools for discipline and education for others, for the herd, perhaps.
And going back to that idea that philosophy is a confession, he says there's absolutely nothing impersonal in the philosopher.
Correct. Their very morality furnishes a decided and decisive testimony as to WHAEI is. You can essentially read the philosopher's character, their fundamental drives and values, right off the structure of their thought. It's deeply personal.
Which brings us back to that powerful idea you mentioned earlier, the philosopher as a creator, a lawgiver.
Yes. They don't just discover pre-existing truth. They actively create new perspectives, new values, new ways of seeing and interpreting the world. They give laws, first to themselves and then potentially to others or to an era.
But this isn't easy, you're saying. Not just anyone can do this.
Definitely not, according to Nietzsche. He suggests being a philosopher, in this higher creative sense, requires descent. It must be bred for it, he says, over many generations. It's not just about having a high IQ, it's about a deep, perhaps inherited disposition, a certain strength of will and character, a capacity for enduring solitude and doubt.
It sounds like a really tough path. What are the defining traits of this higher philosopher, this solitary figure he describes?
He paints a picture of them as a solitary, often concealed, a divergent man, someone who strives to live beyond good and evil in the conventional sense, through their own self-mastery. They are the master of his virtues, possessing a superabundance of will and immense inner strength and drive.
Like a hermit.
He uses the image of a cave bear or a treasure seeker in his cave, someone withdrawn from the everyday world, digging deep into difficult, potentially dangerous ideas.
Maybe even a bit afraid of what they might find down there, perhaps in themselves.
So he acknowledges that. He says the philosopher often runs away from himself, is often afraid of himself, but whose curiosity always makes him come to himself again. It's a constant struggle. This path requires tremendous inner fortitude, a combination of sternness and cheerfulness, because, as he notes quite grimly, the ruination of higher men is in fact the rule. It's a dangerous existence. Succeeding is the exception.
You know, one of the striking things about the book is that it isn't just these structured arguments. It's also packed full of these standalone, almost aphoristic observations, little flashes of insight.
It really is. They're like little gems scattered throughout the text, like this one. If a man has character, he has also his typical experience, which always recurs. It suggests our core nature kind of shapes the patterns and events that repeat in our lives.
Yeah, that resonates. Or that provocative thought, the sage as astronomer. So long as thou feelest the stars as an above thee, thou lackest the eye of the discerning one.
It's like saying true wisdom means seeing beyond conventional hierarchies, maybe even seeing ourselves as part of that cosmic process, not just underneath it.
That's a great one. And this powerful line, it is not the strength but the duration of great sentiments that makes great men. Endurance, that consistency of feeling or purpose, is what truly defines greatness for him, not just momentary flashes.
And the slightly cynical, maybe realistic observation, a great man, I always see merely the play actor of his own ideal. Is he questioning authenticity or just highlighting that even greatness requires a kind of performance, requires striving consciously to become that ideal?
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? And there are plenty relating to psychology and relationships too, like the almost brutal honesty of discovering reciprocal love should really disenchant the lover with regard to the beloved. And what she is modest enough to love even you, or stupid enough, or ouch, that's pure Nietzsche right there. And this one feels quite relatable. One loves ultimately one's desires, not the thing desired, meaning we love what the person or thing represents to us, the need it fulfills in us, more than the object itself.
He also has these sharp observations on consequence and time, like the consequences of our actions seize us by the forelock, very indifferent to the fact that we have improved. Your past actions, their effects, they catch up with you regardless of whether you think you've changed since then.
Yeah, you can't just erase the past. And that classic feeling of hindsight, captured perfectly here, it is too bad. Always the old story. When a man has finished building his house, he finds that he has learned unawares something which he ought absolutely to have known before he began to build. The eternal, fatal, too late.
So true. And not just about building literal houses, obviously. It applies to so many life projects.
But amidst the critique, he even finds room for a kind of optimism, maybe, about human potential for joy, for lightness. Perhaps. Our laughter itself may have a future.
Yes. And he ranks philosophers by the quality of their laughter, up to those who are capable of golden laughter. That suggests a kind of profound affirmation, a lightness achieved by transcending the petty and the tragic.
He also circles back, though, to the sheer difficulty of being that higher man in what he sees as a plebeian age. To him who has the desires of a lofty and dainty soul, and only seldom finds his table laid and his food prepared, the danger will always be great. Nowadays, however, it is extraordinarily so. It's just hard for sensitive, high-minded individuals to find their place, their spiritual or intellectual sustenance, in a world geared towards the average.
It's a recurring theme, that challenge of the exceptional individual.
And finally, he includes a poem right at the end of the main text, From the Heights, which feels like a very personal reflection that kind of ties many of these ideas together beautifully. It speaks of reaching the midday of life, looking for companions, true friends, but feeling like an other, someone solitary.
Yes, it describes the speaker as a wrestler, by himself, too oft self-wrong, wounded not by external enemies but by self-victory. That really captures that sense of painful self-overcoming we've been talking about, the internal struggle of the philosopher.
Having a taut, perilous bow.
Right, embracing danger and tension, and saying goodbye to old friends, old ways of thinking, and embracing a new path with hoped-for new friends. It's really the poetic expression of that lonely, challenging, self-created journey of the higher individual that he champions throughout the book.
Phew. Okay. That was quite a journey into Nietzsche's often unsettling mind. We've questioned the very nature of truth, seeing it maybe not as a pure goal, but as something driven by instinct, maybe even requiring useful fictions to survive.
We've seen morality presented not as some absolute set of divine or rational rules, but as a tool, a kind of necessary tyranny for shaping humanity, and also as this historical dynamic, this tension between master and slave values.
We've definitely explored his challenging ideas on the will to power as a fundamental drive, his deconstruction of basic concepts we take for granted, like the ego or will, and looked through his deeply critical lens at modern values like democracy, equality, and sympathy, which he really links to the ascendancy of slave morality and the herd.
And we've glimpsed his ideal, the noble soul, the higher philosophers, is this solitary, responsible creator, a lawgiver who tries to be master of themselves, striving perhaps beyond conventional good and evil, even if it's a perilous path. And of course, we touched on his controversial views on things like nationality and women, remembering again that we're relaying the text content neutrally.
He fundamentally challenges you, the listener, to reconsider your own assumptions, your own prejudices, as he'd call them. Why do you value truth in the way that you do? Where do your moral beliefs really come from? Is it instinct, reason, historical inheritance, social pressure? Are you comfortable identifying with the herd, or do you feel that pull towards the solitude, maybe the risk of being an exception?
Nietzsche really forces us to confront some uncomfortable possibilities. That untruth might actually be necessary for life, that perceived weakness can, with great cunning, revalue strength as evil, or that what we often call modern progress might also contain seeds of human diminishment or mediocrity. He reminds us that, at least for certain kinds of individuals, knowledge is creating. Their creating is a law-giving.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, building on this deep dive we've taken. If, as Nietzsche suggests, recognizing untruth might be a condition of life itself, and if the very values that elevate an individual above the crowd might be branded as evil by the prevailing morality, what does that actually mean for your own pursuit of knowledge and for how you define what is good or bad for you personally? Where do you find yourself standing in that ongoing tension between conforming to the rule and perhaps striving to be an exception in your own life, in your own soul?